He came home smiling, holding her hand and their child. My heart stopped, not because I was jealous, but because I finally understood I was never his home, just a placeholder. He told me to understand, so I did. I understood that love doesn't live where respect has already died. If you've ever loved someone who made you feel small, this story will remind you of your worth. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because no woman should ever have to beg for the love she already deserves. I used to think love was supposed to be easy, that if two people wanted the same things, everything else would fall into place. When I first met him, that's exactly how it felt. Effortless. He had this calm confidence, the kind that made me feel safe, like I could finally exhale after holding my breath for years. We met at a friend's wedding, of all places, two strangers sharing laughter over how long the speeches were. I didn't know it then, but that small moment would change my life. He said all the right things, the kind of words that made you believe he saw not just who you were, but who you could become. The early days were beautiful. He'd bring me coffee in bed, remember how I liked my eggs, and kiss my forehead before leaving for work. We talked about everything, our dreams, our fears, the kind of home we wanted to build. I remember thinking, this is what love should feel like. I gave him my trust freely, without hesitation, because he never gave me a reason to hold it back. We got married under a soft sky, surrounded by friends, laughter, and promises we thought we could keep forever. But even in the glow of our beginning, there were small signs I didn't want to see. Times when I'd tell him about something that hurt me, and he'd laugh softly, saying, "You're overthinking again." I'd swallow my feelings, convincing myself that maybe I was too emotional. Maybe I just cared too much. I mistook his silence for stability, his distance for maturity. But looking back now, I see what it really was. Dismissal, disguised as peace. Still, I tried to be the perfect wife. I cooked his favorite meals, supported his career, filled our home with warmth and laughter. When he came home late, I told myself he was tired, not distant. When he forgot our anniversary, I said he was busy, not careless. I built excuses for him, like walls around my heart, trying to protect what I thought was love. But love isn't supposed to feel like you're walking on eggshells to keep someone comfortable. Love isn't silence, it's understanding. And even then, in those first few years, I think a part of me already knew I was starting to disappear in the very life I helped build. The silence came gradually, not like a storm, but like fog. You don't notice it at first, it just slips in quietly, soft enough to make you believe everything's fine. That's how it was with us. The laughter that once filled our mornings turned into routine greetings. The long talks before bed became one-word exchanges. Good night. Fine. Later. I kept telling myself that every marriage slows down, that comfort replaces passion, and silence doesn't always mean distance. But deep down, I knew better. I started to miss being seen, not in the way strangers notice your outfit or smile at your kindness, but truly seen. I'd talk about my day, about something that made me proud, and he'd nod without looking up from his phone. Once, I told him I felt lonely, even when he was right beside me. He sighed and said, "You always make things bigger than they are." I laughed it off that night, but later, I cried in the bathroom so he wouldn't hear. There's a special kind of heartbreak that comes from being invisible to someone who promised to love you. I tried harder, planning date nights, leaving little notes, cooking his favorites again. But every gesture felt like shouting into a void. He'd say, "Thanks," then go back to his laptop. The man I once shared dreams with now shared nothing but silence. I told myself he was stressed from work, that maybe he just needed space. But that space began to stretch until it felt like an ocean between us. There were nights I'd sit on the couch beside him, our shoulders almost touching, and still feel like I was alone. The TV would play in the background, our marriage reduced to background noise. I stopped asking questions because I was tired of hearing answers that made me feel small. I started writing again, journaling every thought I couldn't say aloud. Those pages became my only safe place. And yet, Despite the ache, I stayed because love, real or imagined, teaches you endurance before it teaches you escape. I kept hoping he'd turn toward me again, that one morning he'd see me, really see me. But each sunrise brought the same cold truth. I was married to a man who no longer remembered how to listen. It started with a name. One evening, while we were eating dinner in almost total silence, he looked up from his phone and said casually, "You remember I told you about my old friend from college? She's back in town." His tone was calm, unbothered, like it was nothing. But something in my stomach tightened. There was a softness in his voice I hadn't heard in a long time, a warmth that wasn't meant for me. I smiled politely and asked how she was. He said, "She's been through a lot. Life didn't go the way she hoped." Then he looked down again, like that conversation had already ended. I didn't say anything more, but that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept wondering why his face lit up at the mention of her name, when it hadn't lit up for me in months. Over the next few weeks, I started hearing her name more often. "She called today," he'd say. "She needed some advice." Or, "I might stop by her office. She's starting a small business and could use some help." Each time I'd force a smile and pretend it didn't bother me, but it did. Every part of me ached to ask, why her? Why now? Why like this? But instead, I stayed quiet, because I'd learned he only heard what he wanted to hear. Then came the day he brought her up again, but this time there was a child in the story. "She has a little boy," he said softly. "He's about 6. She's raising him alone." There was pride in his voice, admiration even, and jealousy, not the ugly kind, but the kind that comes from realizing you've been replaced emotionally before you're replaced physically. I tried to act normal, but every time her name slipped from his mouth, I felt a piece of my self-worth chip away. I met her a few weeks later, by accident, or maybe by fate's cruel sense of humor. She came by his office while I was dropping off his lunch. She was polite, charming, confident. Her little boy clung to her hand, shy but smiling. I remember her saying, "You must be his wife. He talks about you sometimes." Sometimes. That word echoed in my head like a bell. From that day forward, she wasn't just a story. She was a presence. She called often, sent messages that made him laugh. Laughter I hadn't heard in so long. He began coming home later, saying he was helping her with some paperwork. I stopped asking questions. I stopped hoping for explanations. I just observed, quietly, like someone watching their own life unravel in slow motion. I started realizing that love doesn't always end with a fight. Sometimes it ends with laughter that no longer includes you. And even as I sat across from him, watching his eyes drift somewhere far away, I knew something in our marriage had already shifted. He didn't have to say it. I could feel it. His heart had already started remembering someone I never stopped trying to be for him. The day he brought them home, it was raining. The kind of slow, steady rain that makes the world feel smaller, quieter, more suffocating. I remember opening the door and seeing him standing there, drenched but smiling, holding an umbrella over her head. Beside her stood the little boy, his small backpack slipping off one shoulder. "They'll be staying with us for a few days," he said, his voice calm, as if he were announcing something as ordinary as dinner plans. I stood frozen. "They'll be staying with us." The words didn't sound real. I wanted to believe I'd misheard him. But the suitcase she carried told the truth. My heart pounded in my chest as I forced a smile, that practice smile I'd learned to wear when things didn't make sense. "Of course," I whispered, though my throat felt tight. She smiled back sweetly and said, "You're so understanding. Not everyone would be." The child ran inside, his laughter echoing down the hallway I used to fill with music and warmth. Now it sounded foreign, like a stranger's joy inside my home. That night, I cooked dinner for 4. I set the table, trying to ignore the way he looked at her, a look I hadn't seen in years, familiar, tender. I told myself it was just kindness, but deep down, I knew better. I noticed how easily they fell back into rhythm, finishing each other's sentences, laughing at inside jokes from years ago. I sat quietly, my smile steady, my heart cracking one silent line at a time. Later, I stood in the kitchen, washing dishes, watching them from the reflection in the window. She leaned toward him, whispering something that made him grin. The boy called him Daddy by accident. He froze, then smiled softly and said, "It's okay." I felt my knees weaken. Every ounce of pride I had left was screaming for me to walk away, but my body stayed still. When they went to bed that night, I stayed awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling. My house no longer felt like mine. My marriage no longer felt sacred. And the man beside me, the man I'd once trusted with every piece of my soul, had turned our home into a memory I could no longer live in. That was the night I realized betrayal doesn't always come with violence or lies. Sometimes it walks right through your front door, smiling. I don't know what woke me that night. Maybe the sound of quiet laughter down the hall, or maybe it was my own heart refusing to sleep through its breaking. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the air still smelled like it hadn't decided to forgive. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, and followed the faint glow of light spilling from the living room. That's when I heard it, his voice, soft and warm, the way it used to sound when he spoke to me. Only this time, it wasn't meant for me. He was sitting on the couch with her, their heads close together, their voices low but unmistakable. "I never stopped loving you," he said. The words were so gentle, so deliberate, that they felt rehearsed, as if he'd carried them around, waiting for the right moment to let them go. My breath caught in my throat, but I didn't make a sound. I just stood there, half hidden in the shadow of the hallway, watching the man I'd loved all these years say everything I once begged to hear to someone else. She smiled through tears, whispering, "Maybe it's fate we found our way back." And then she reached for his hand. He didn't pull away. He didn't even flinch. He just let it happen, like betrayal was the most natural thing in the world. I remember my fingers trembling as I pressed them against the wall to steady myself. My vision blurred, but not from tears, from disbelief. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to make them see the pain they'd created. But instead, I walked back to my room in silence. Because in that moment, I realized nothing I said could fix what was already gone. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My face looked calm, but my soul was collapsing quietly inside me. Years of loyalty, patience, and blind faith, all crumbling in one whispered confession. I didn't cry that night. I didn't ask him why. I just folded my hands in my lap and thought, so this is how love ends. Not with a fight, but with a choice someone else made for you. By morning, I had decided. I wouldn't beg to be kept where I was no longer wanted. Love had left the house, and I was finally ready to follow it out the door. By the next morning, everything felt strangely calm. I moved through the house like a ghost, silent, steady, invisible. He greeted me with a casual morning, as if nothing had happened, as if the night before hadn't torn through the foundation of our marriage. I looked at him for a long moment, and in that stillness, I saw it clearly. The man I'd loved was gone. Maybe he'd been gone for a while, and I was only now brave enough to admit it. I made breakfast, not out of love, but habit. He talked about work, about errands, about meaningless things that suddenly sounded like noise. I nodded, pretending to listen, my heart already somewhere else, somewhere free. That afternoon, while he was in his office, I gathered what mattered most: my documents, a few clothes, my wedding album, and my dignity. I didn't take jewelry or anything that sparkled. I didn't want reminders of promises that had lost their shine. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of paper and lemon polish. I sat across from the attorney, my hands folded neatly on the desk, and said the words I never thought I'd have the courage to say: "I want a divorce." My voice didn't shake. It didn't tremble. It sounded like truth. When the papers were ready, I signed my name, slowly, carefully, like sealing the final chapter of a book I'd outgrown. When I came home, he was waiting. The woman and her child were gone, at least for now. He looked at me with a mix of confusion and fear. "What's this?" he asked, holding the envelope I placed on the table. "It's what you wanted," I said quietly. "You just didn't have the courage to say it." He tried to argue, to explain, but his words no longer reached me. Every excuse he offered fell flat against the wall I'd built in my heart. "You're overreacting," he said, the same words he'd used to shrink my feelings for years. I smiled faintly and whispered, "Not this time." Then I turned and walked away. There was no shouting, no dramatic ending, just a quiet exhale, the sound of freedom. I stepped outside into the sunlight, feeling the air touch my face like forgiveness. I wasn't broken, I was just done. And for the first time in years, that felt like peace. The first morning after I left, I woke up to silence, but this time it didn't hurt. There was no tension, no waiting for footsteps in the hallway, no heavy sighs over breakfast, just peace, the kind that hums quietly, like the world finally letting you breathe again. I sat by the window of my small apartment, sunlight spilling across the floor, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I felt present. I felt alive. Those first few weeks were hard. I cried sometimes, not for him, but for the woman I used to be, the one who gave everything, even when she was running on empty. The one who mistook endurance for love and silence for strength. I grieved her, then slowly began to rebuild her. I started going for morning walks, writing again, smiling at strangers. I filled my space with flowers, not the expensive kind he used to buy for show, but the kind that bloomed wildly, beautifully, on their own. It was strange how light the world felt once I no longer carried someone else's neglect. I began volunteering at a women's center, helping others who had been where I once stood, lost, afraid, unsure if leaving meant failure. I told them what I had learned the hardest way possible. Leaving isn't giving up. Sometimes it's choosing yourself over slow destruction. Months later, I was invited to speak at a community event. Standing there, looking out at faces of women who had survived their own quiet wars, I realized my story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to every woman who had ever been told to stay silent, to shrink, to settle. My voice didn't shake when I said, "Sometimes strength doesn't roar. Sometimes it just walks away. And that's enough." When the applause came, it didn't sound like praise. It sounded like healing. That night, walking home under the city lights, I thought about how far I'd come, the house I'd left behind, the pain I'd carried, the love I'd lost. All of it had shaped me into someone new. I wasn't his wife anymore. I wasn't someone's mistake or second choice. I was my own beginning. He brought his past home, but I built my future from it, piece by piece, day by day, until it finally looked like freedom. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because every time a woman finds her voice, another story of silence ends.